Did you know that East Aurora once had its very own opera house? Hi folks, Robert Lowell Goller here, and thank you for joining me for our weekly chats about local history. Now, a couple weeks ago I talked about the Great Fire of October of 1905, at least that's what I called it. And that fire took down the Warner House Hotel, which stood right behind me here, or behind you, at the present site of the Aurora Theater, and it destroyed a big four-story hotel that was on that site. And during that fire, they saved the Opera House, which was located right behind me, as well as all the rest of the buildings on Main Street, thanks to the volunteer firefighters and other volunteers who came in to spray all the buildings down in 1905 to save all those buildings. And I talked about the Opera House, and I talked about how in the 1905 fire, because of the efforts of the volunteers, they saved the Opera House, only for the Opera House to burn down in a separate fire only 3 years later in 1908. So in the process of talking about that a few weeks ago, I got a lot of questions about the Opera House fire and the Opera House itself. Turns out not a lot of folks have recalled or knew that we had an opera house in the village of East Aurora. As a matter of fact, we did, like many communities, have a civic effort to bring an opera house to our main street. Now, you may be familiar with the Lancaster Opera House, a similar movement. Lots of communities like East Aurora, like Lancaster, wanted to have a meeting place, a venue where you could have community events and bring in events from outside the community, guest speakers, guest singers, guest performances. So it was a very big deal to have an opera house on your main street. So in the 1890s, there was an effort to bring an opera house to the location right behind me on East Aurora's Main Street. It replaced the church that was there. The Presbyterian Church was located at the corner of Main and Church Streets, and as I talked about in a previous video, the church is why the street's named Church Street today, even though there's no church there anymore. So they moved the church building and they built the Opera House at the corner. And the Opera House might be a misnomer for the name because it wasn't just operas that were held there. Yes, they did have operas, but a lot of other different kinds of events were held there. Our Opera House here in the village of East Aurora opened on January 26th of 1894. And it opened with a comedy performance, and village officials were there, and they opened it with speeches. It was that big of a deal. Front page of the East Aurora Advertiser made a big deal about the opening of our Opera House on Main Street. And it served its purpose here in our community. And just like in other communities, in Lancaster it still does serve this, where it doubled as the town hall or village hall. So in Lancaster, they have government offices in the Opera House still today. And we have the same thing. The village offices, the village files were kept in the Opera House, and then there was a venue. So this served many purposes. The auditorium of the Opera House, political rallies. They had guest speakers, graduation ceremonies were held there. In fact, because there wasn't enough room at the school at Main and North Grove Streets, for large gatherings, they had the graduation ceremonies here at the Opera House for many years. They had rented it out for balls and dances and wedding receptions and fraternal lodge events. I went through the East Aurora Advertiser, just did a search of Opera House to find out what kind of events were held there. And it was quite interesting to see the number of events that were held there. Wrestling matches. They actually had a couple wrestling matches, fundraising wrestling matches inside the Opera House, which I found quite interesting. And yes, there were a few operas in the Opera House. Now, on the morning of June 2nd of 1908, a fire broke out. Now, we call it the Opera House fire, but the fire itself did not break out in the Opera House. There were other buildings surrounding it, including a building called the Tackberry Building, and in that building was a bakery. And the fire broke out in the bakery, and it soon became out of control. There was a baker working early, and he noticed the fire, but he couldn't summon help. A dog actually woke up one of the neighbors, and what was another interesting thing is they call the operator, the telephone company operator, and they sound the gong. There were gongs that alerted people to fires in the community, and it would make a gong sound at that point. Later there were sirens, but it was interesting that that's how they sounded the alarm. People came in their night clothes. They said that in the report of the East Aurora Advertiser to come out, and the fire departments from, again, East Aurora and the surrounding area were summoned. They soon realized that the Opera House was a losing battle, and the Tackberry Building and all the buildings that surrounded it were a losing battle. So what they did, just like the fire of 1905, focused their efforts on saving the rest of Main Street. There were a lot of wooden buildings, including Vidler's section and buildings across the street that the sparks were flying, and they were concerned. So they doused those buildings with water, just like the 1905 fire, to save the rest of Main Street. So the Opera House was gone, and the buildings surrounding it, but the rest of Main Street was saved thanks to the efforts of our fire department and volunteers. What made this fire especially dangerous is there was reports of alcohol in containers and generators that exploded during the fire, and they called it pyrotechnics. Now, mind you, a fire like this, just like the fire in 1905, would bring out a crowd to watch, and it was actually quite dangerous. There were explosions reported from this fire at the Opera House, and it proved quite dangerous. Interestingly, the 1905 fire that took down the Warner House Hotel was called the worst fire in East Aurora's history at the time, and then the 1908 fire was called the worst fire in East Aurora's history just 3 years later. So on the same intersection, within 3 years, we had two pretty devastating fires. The second fire was also more dangerous in the fact people were trapped. There were apartments on the upper floors, and there were reports right behind me. There would have been ladders going up to save people from their apartments. People were sleeping. It wasn't like the Warner House fire that was in the evening hours. This would have been overnight at the Opera House. So two different times, which made a big difference. So that's what happened to the Opera House. And it was quite devastating because they decided, because it was a nonprofit civic effort, that they would not be able to rebuild. The graduation ceremony that was scheduled for the class of 1908 at the end of June, we actually, in the archives of the Aurora Town Historian's Office, have an invitation ticket to the 1908 commencement that says it's at the Opera House, but they had to quickly change it, and they held it, I think, at a local church instead, because it was the fire occurred just weeks before the graduation ceremony. So the Opera House burned, and it was replaced by the building that's behind me that was known as the Tackberry Furniture Company. The Tackberry family owned it. They owned a furniture store, and they built this building behind me. And you might notice that it's built of brick, and that's what happened after all these buildings burned. They replaced them with brick buildings. Now, so East Aurora lost its Opera House. Lancaster still has its Opera House. Several decades ago, it was refurbished and lots of it restored. But that building is brick. And it was built around the same time, but their Opera House was built with brick and ours was built with wood. They still have theirs. We do not still have ours. So that's the history of the Opera House. To answer your question, yes, East Aurora had an Opera House. It served us from 1894 to 1908. And then after the Opera House burned, other venues came along. The Millard Fillmore Theater, which I've talked about before, which would have been located over here. And then after the Millard Fillmore Theater in 1925, we got the Aurora Theater, which is over here. But before that, we had the Opera House lost to fire on June 2nd, 1908. So I hope that answers all your questions about the Opera House of East Aurora. As always, thank you for joining me for our weekly chats about local history. I am Robert Lowell Goller. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comment section or send me a private message. If you want to know more about my projects, just visit my website, robertlowellgoller.com. And as always, I appreciate you joining me. Thank you for keeping history alive, and we'll see you next time. Take care.